Hello and welcome to the Kinda Queer podcast, a podcast hosted by, it's just me today, so one singular kinda queer folk. My name is Ryan, I use he, they pronouns, and my sexuality isn't really all that relevant here today. So today, what am I talking about? Well, of course, I'm talking about alcohol. Um... Which may sound kind of weird coming from me, but this is actually, it's an episode that, like, I both want to do. Like, I'm not being forced to do this. Um, but this is an episode that I am recording, which will serve as my final project for one of my classes, which talks about the folklore of alcohol. And it's a communications course, and so it deals with communications and the folklore of alcohol, as is evident by the title of, what I'm talking about and the course. And so I noticed that in some of these myths and folklores and stories and tales and whatever other synonym you want to come up with for these different alcoholic beverages, is that a lot of them deal with the gender in a very interesting way. And so I kind of wanted to talk about some of those myths and tales and stories and how gender kind of runs into them or interconnects with them. And also afterwards I kind of want to talk about some of the other stuff, and there's some history stuff I want to look at, and like the gender norms that some of these myths have produced or enforced. And I think it'll be a very interesting episode. I think that you will have fun listening. God, I hope. I'm so sorry if this is not interesting to you, but it is to me. And I want to start off by saying, no, I am not of legal drinking age, and no, I do not drink alcohol. But I do not think that there's anything wrong with drinking. And so I think I just want to say right off the bat, please drink responsibly. If you are of drinking age and you are going to drink, please drink responsibly. That's all I have to say, really. That's all I want to say, I guess, on that. So I guess, shall we jump in? I think we shall. One of the first stories that I want to talk about and myths is surrounding pulque. And I'm not really going to talk about any of the specifics behind these beverages, and I could. And there's a lot of, actual scientific, what's the word? I don't know, terminology that just kind of goes into making these drinks. They all have very unique processes and whatnot, but I'm not as interested in that. I think it is interesting to see how that's progressed and some of the history behind it, but I'm more interested in like the social aspect of this stuff. I'm not so much interested in how do you make pulque. For what is important to know for this, pulque is a traditional Mexican drink, not just Mexican, but mostly Mexican drink. And it is made from agave or maguey plants. I am sorry also if I butcher any pronunciations. A lot of these pronunciations that I'm going to be saying in this episode are not ones that are native to me. And so I apologize if I mispronounce anything. I am going to try my best. And if I do mispronounce, you can cut off my head, put on a spike somewhere. That's okay. But just know that I do apologize. But so we're talking about the agave plant or the maguey plant, which is kind of, I think personally, I know it's not actually spelled maguey. It's Maguey. But I believe it's pronounced maguey. And so I think that's fitting for this kind of queer podcast, that it sounds like you're just saying gay. Anyway, so the maguey plant or the agave plant, I might interchange the two. I don't know. It depends. One of the myths that I want to talk about is the myth surrounding the maguey plant, mayahuel, and other gods, these come from the Mayans, the Aztecs, and other cultures. And so while these myths aren't like as prominent now, they certainly still are around and followed by some people. And so I just want to talk about this one in specifically. So, as for the mythology behind it, there is a goddess of the maguey plant or the agave plant, which has in many respects become synonymous with pulque. Um, in Central America, she was known as Mayahuel. And in some places, Mayahuel is also considered the goddess of tequila, mostly because pulque is kind of the predecessor to tequila and mezcal in a lot of ways. But Mayahuel is considered the goddess of tequila in some places, but not everywhere. And it's important to note that these myths that I will be talking about surrounding Mayahuel are not about tequila. They are about pulque, and they were created not recently. They were created with the Aztecs, is mostly what I'm gaining most of my information from here. So a lot of it is Aztec mythology. And so this is not recent. But in most depictions, Mayahuel is depicted as a beautiful young woman, and she's also heavily associated with fertility. And so I don't really want to compare anything too much here, but I will say that if you're familiar with like Greek mythology or other mythologies, Mayahuel it's kind of reminiscent of what we might call a fertility goddess, in that she's known for fertility and kind of in some aspects helping fertility. And I also want to say, before I get too deep into the telling of this myth, is that from a folklore standpoint, it's important to kind of read them without altering them. And so I've done my best to keep these as authentic as possible, these retellings, and some of the sources I've gained from class itself and the podcast that we listen to for class. And so there is like this thing that I have to do where I have to interpret certain things, but I want to tell the story first, and then I'm going to add my interpretation after, which is just one of many interpretations. You can have any other interpretation of these myths and tales and stories, but I want to kind of try and tell the story first so that it's kind of told more authentically. And I think that coming from a folklore or folklorist perspective, that is important. You don't want to change it, because that, if you do change it, that will have drastic effects on things. So I will try my best not to do that. So another interesting aspect of Mayahuel is that she is often referred to as having 400 breasts. And that kind of leans into the fertility thing a lot, I think. But I think one of the reasons, or at least one of the assumed reasons for why she's kind of referred to in this way, is because agave and maguey plants have a kind of milk-like sap to them. And so that's kind of where the assumption of Mayahuel with the 400 breasts comes in. And so the myth behind pulque specifically goes as follows. So the god Quetzalcoatl, which I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, it is kind of like this very famous great god in Aztec Mayan mythology. And Quetzalcoatl, I believe the best pronunciation from what I've seen is Quetzalcoatl. So the god Quetzalcoatl one day noticed that the humans seemed to be miserable, at least after like a hard days of work. And like that isn't synonymous with what we now know as a hard day's work, so to speak. But he noticed that they weren't singing, they weren't dancing, they weren't having fun, they weren't playing around. And so he was kind of upset with this, and he wanted to do something with that. That's a little sidebar that we're going to set away for now. But then, one day, he fell in love with Mayahuel. And the thing about Mayahuel is that she is the granddaughter of Zitzimitl. And Zitzimitl is usually referred to as sort of a more evil goddess. She lived in the sky and she would devour light. And so people would do human sacrifices so that she would give them more light. So she kind of consumed this light, devoured light, and people would sacrifice in order to get some of that light back. And Quetzalcoatl was not happy that Zitzimiro was stealing this light, and with her general evilness, so to speak. And so he went into the sky to fight her. But instead of fighting her, he found Mayahuel, and he fell in love with Mayahuel. And so he brought her down to earth to live with him. But Zitzimiro eventually found out and grew very angry, very upset. How could you steal my granddaughter away? But she was more angry at Mayahuel than she was at Quetzalcoatl, and so this is a classic setup for a tragic story. Zitzimiro is roaming around looking for these two on Earth, and they keep moving from place to place, and eventually they kind of run out of places to hide. And so Quetzalcoatl decides that because they have nowhere else to hide, they should become trees to disguise themselves. In some cases, they become two branches of a tree, but in other cases, they become two whole trees. And the one that I kind of like the most is the two trees. And so here they stand as two trees, two beautiful trees, and they are side by side. And whenever the wind blows their leaves rustle against each other, tree to tree, leaf to leaf. And so this is kind of interpreted as the two gods caressing each other. And so it's kind of like this beautiful, lovely story where these two gods in hiding become trees, and whenever the wind blows, they get to meet. Or at least that's, I don't know, I think that's kind of cool, beautiful. It's a little bittersweet for sure, but I think it's beautiful. And so this evil goddess, Zitzimiro, keeps searching for them and has not the best of luck. And so she sends out, in some cases, stars, light devouring stars, in other cases, just straight up like demon creatures, things. I don't know, I'm just going to call them demons. And so it depends on which myth you're looking at. So she sends them out, the demons, the light devouring stars, to find them, and eventually they do. They find Mayahuel. Again, in some myths, the two goddesses fight. Mayahuel and Zitzimiro, they fight. And in this telling, Mayahuel is killed. But in others, and one that I think I like more, is that instead of a fight, Zitzimiro destroys the tree that is Mayahuel, ripping it into two, ripping it apart, tearing it into pieces, killing Mayahuel in the process. And so the demons, or the stars, eat her, devour her, leaving only scraps of Mayahuel left behind. Quetzalcoatl finds out eventually, and he's very angry and very sad, and he collects the little bits that he can find of Mayahuel left, the ones that the demons didn't devour, the little scraps of Mayahuel left, and he tenderly buries them. Kind of creates this sort of grave burial site for Mayahuel. And the buried remains of Mayahuel then grow into the first maguey, or agave plant, which humans eventually in turn use to make pulque. I think that is so bittersweet and beautiful, and I think it's just really wonderful. But in other tellings of this myth, Quetzalcoatl buries it, but the plant doesn't grow right away. It doesn't grow from just Mayahuel. And so every night, Quetzalcoatl goes out and he visits Mayahuel's grave every night, and he weeps. He cries, and he's just generally really sad. And so the other gods notice, and they feel sorry for Quetzalcoatl. And so they give him the gift of a plant that grows from Mayahuel's grave. And this, of course, is the maguey plant. And what they do for this, to this plant, I guess, that they let grow from her grave, is they give it minor hallucinogenic properties in order to comfort Quetzalcoatl's soul. And so that kind of ties more closely into the actual like uses of this plant and pulque, of what might have been at the time. And interestingly enough, kind of where some more, I guess, specific gender, and I think that there are certainly interpretations of gender that you can make in that myth alone, but I think even further where gender kind of comes into the mix here is on the children of Mayahuel. So Mayahuel, the 400-breasted goddess, also has 400 children, and they are all represented as rabbits. Some people interpret this as a rabbits breeding joke, so to speak, in that like rabbits breed a lot. They're well known for breeding, and so that kind of carries on this fertility idea. But in other interpretations, it's just simply that it was believed that a rabbit first discovered the maguey or agave plant, and it's or at least first discovered the juices of it by nibbling on its leaves. And so her children, these 400 children, all rabbits, would drink from her 400 breasts. And each one of them is kind of, and this isn't always the case, some are representative of other things, but in certain myths or tellings, each one of these children is representative of a different face or personality that someone may display while intoxicated or under the influence of pulque, you name it. And also just kind of generally, they also sometimes represent just sexual lust, which again kind of follows this theme of fertility. But also, interestingly enough, in most stories, the majority of these rabbits or children are male. And then kind of just another fun add-on I want to put on this is that some people believe that a man who has not produced any sons can harvest 6 of these agave maguey plants, drink the pulque elixir made from it, and then his next child will be a boy. And then conversely, if women do the same, or they drink this pulque elixir, it will aid in menstruation and lactation. So again, we find these very interesting dynamics that kind of derive from gender and fertility. Now that I've kind of laid out all of these myths and stories and tales, I kind of want to at least lay on one of or some of my interpretations of it, and how I think that it kind of relates to gender and gender norms in general and interconnects with it. Something that I find interesting is that this kind of feels like one of those classic the girl runs away with her lover stories, and then like the angry grandmother or mother or stepmother has to come down and bring her back. Only in this case, she's killed. I don't know what my full interpretation of that is. It's like a stereotype, like a story stereotype. But before the stereotype was kind of ever brought into the mainstream, it's kind of this potential origin of this type of story. And I think that it kind of brings about this idea that, women are weaker, or that they should not be allowed to run off with any man that they please. Otherwise, they will be slain by their evil grandmother or whatever. And then I think like the 400 children of hers, all mostly being male, all mostly, yeah, good work, Ryan. Most of them being male is really interesting because they are drinking from her 400 breasts and they all represent this different face of intoxication. And so, is that like saying that only men should be allowed to drink and that like women should be the producers of alcoholic drinks and beverages? Is it saying that, men kind of indulge on these on the intoxicating effects of alcohol, and what is left behind is so many different faces? I don't know. That's up for you to think about as well. Um, but particularly, I absolutely love, and by love I mean I don't love it. I mean, I think it's so interesting is the little add-on that, oh, right, the add-on, I forgot about the add-on. Remember when I said that Quetzalcoatl noticed that these humans were miserable after a hard day's work? Well, in some stories, eventually he also gives humans pulque and agave in order for them to be happy again, to enjoy life, to drink, to sing, to dance. And so that's another part of the story. I forgot about that, so I'm sorry. I'm sorry I forgot about that. But the add-on I was starting to talk about before I got distracted is add-on about the man harvesting the 6 plants and then drinking the pulque elixir, and then his next child will be a boy. It just seems to me to kind of bring on this idea that men are needed, that you need to have men in society to run things, because a man with children, with only daughters, is not a real man. This man needs to have a son so that that son can then be taught all the ways of what a man is, so that this son can grow up and be head of the household and do all the hard work and hard labor. And then conversely, women, if women drink this elixir, it doesn't work in a similar way. It doesn't give them, it doesn't ensure that their next child is going to be a girl. Instead, it just simply aids in menstruation and lactation. So it's like women, it kind of implies, right, that women are more simply here for reproduction. They are more simply here so that they can reproduce and raise children, and nothing more than that. They're the one. That's what their importance is in society. Nothing more. Maybe a little more. Maybe a little more, but at least that's kind of my interpretation of that. And so from there, I kind of want to move on to a different kind of story that's related in a way, because now I want to talk about mezcal. Mezcal is, one of those, mezcal and tequila specifically, are those drinks that are kind of the next in line after the predecessor of pulque. I think that these drinks, especially mezcal, have kind of a deep, rich history of representing some form of masculinity. Um, and I would like to turn to a specific tale about it, or rather a corrido. And a corrido is, it's essentially a tale or a narrative type of song that is typically in the form of poetry or ballad. And so this is El Corrido de Pedro el Chicharrón, or the Song of Pedro the Chicharrón. And you can look it up anywhere else. And I have all of the links to my sources on the YouTube version of this podcast. So in the description of the video version of this podcast on YouTube, there will be all the links that I used for sources, including where you can find the full lyrics to this. The general story, the general gist of the story is Pedro el Chicharrón is asked by a colonel to meet him. Pedro is, or at least the colonel wants to meet Pedro. This is during a time of, revolutions and war and internal conflicts. And so he eventually ends up at this bar, this cantina, and with his friend, and he is told to remove all weapons. So he doesn't have any weapons on him, and he goes to this cantina with his friend, and the friend asks for them to serve him some mezcal or tequila. And then his friend, I believe, and I could be wrong, I could be translating wrong, but it's either a friend or someone else comes. I think it might actually be other people come. Again, my Spanish is not great, I apologize. And they end up shooting him, and he feels the bullet. And what he does is he wants for people to never forget him. And so El Corrido de Pedro el Chicharron is kind of this tale to make sure that Pedro lives on forever. And the part that I think is really interesting is that he calls for his girlfriend so that he can bite her arm, leaving a permanent mark on her so that she will never forget him. It's all very macho, and I think it's really interesting. And I think that this kind of tells a tale of masculinity, right? That this shootout, this shootout happens in this cantina where he specifically is given or asks for mezcal. And so you see this masculine, just kind of like, guns blazing, I'm a man, I fight. And then you further see it's men kind of owning women in a sense, like, let me bite your arm so you never forget me. It's just a very interesting tale, and I think that kind of generally speaking, and I know I'm getting ahead of myself, but I think that generally speaking, alcohol has always kind of been a more masculine thing in society, and we see that kind of that theme permeate through all of these myths and stories and tales where, something happens, whatever. But in this case, it's kind of symbolic that this mezcal kind of brings about this masculine violence, this masculine show of power. And then we're going to turn to Genever, which is similar to gin. What I want to talk about in relation to Genever is a ballad called Bung Your Eye. And so this is kind of a term that people would use, like you drink Genever and like your face contorts, and that was called like bung your eye. You're bunging your eye. Imagine how like people contort their faces when they like eat something really sour. That's kind of like the idea here. And so this is the ballad of Bung Your Eye. As a buxom young fellow was walking the street, a certain fair maiden he chanced to meet. As she drew him near, she said, "Will you buy? Pray, what do you sell?" And she replies, "Bung your eye." "To be serious, fair maiden, what have you got there? Would you wish for an answer both kind and sincere? 'Tis Holland's Genever, called by the by. As a nickname, young friend, it's Bung Your Eye. If you be a gentleman, as you do appear, to sell all my Genever I need not fear. When I speak to some neighbors as they pass by, I'll leave you to the care of this Bung Your Eye." The woman being gone, it was his intent to look into her basket, he was fully bent. But in a few minutes a young child did cry, and instead of Genever, he found a young Bung Your Eye. "Oh, curse this bad woman! What has she got here? I bought Genever, I vow very dear, and now I'm afraid all the lasses as they pass me by will call me the father of young Bung Your Eye." Bung Uri he took home, as I've heard say, to have the child christened without more delay. Says the parson who sees him, I'll christen the child by and by. What name will you give him? And he said, Bung Uri. Bung Uri, says the parson, that's a very odd name. Oh, yes, sir, he said, and in an odd way it came. I'm afraid all the lasses, as they pass me by, will think I the father of young Bung Uri. So come all you young fellows that walk in the street, beware of those maidens you chance for to meet. For Holland's Genever put me in surprise. Believe me, my girls, it bunged up my eyes. So, I think this is a really fun one. I don't know why I think it's fun. It just, I really like this ballad. So to kind of try and sum that up and explain it a little bit more, this woman here has a child, and she is trying to sell to this man the child. And so she kind of she disguises the child as Holland's Genever, or gives it the nickname Bung Uri. So she is selling to this man Bung Uri the child under the guise of Genever. He thinks it's Genever. Many people believe that this woman is probably most likely a prostitute, and that the child is hers. And she's trying to pawn it off to this man, to sell it to this man, so that she can go and buy actual Genever to drink. So this man buys the child, not knowing that it's a child, thinking that it's Holland's Genever. And when he looks into the basket after buying it, he sees that it's a child, and he's upset, and he thinks that anyone passing by, any of the lasses, any of the women passing by, will think that the child is his. He denies that this child is his. It's not his. But eventually he takes it, and he kind of assumes, quote unquote, ownership of it. He assumes care of this child, is probably the better way to put it. And he takes the child to be christened, and he names the child Bung Uri. I interpret this ballad a little bit differently than I think some people do. My interpretation is that this man probably is the actual father of Bung Uri, and that this woman is what most people assume, is that she is probably a prostitute. And I think the way that I interpret this is that this man, under the influence, possibly both of them, both the man and the woman, he impregnates this woman. And so Bung Uri is his. Or maybe this child isn't his specifically, but he has done this to other women, other prostitutes. And then later, this woman, this prostitute, gives him the child, or sneakily pawns it off on him. And he goes, this isn't my child. And the way that I interpret this is that it is never a man's fault for being under the influence, for being intoxicated. An intoxicated man's actions are no fault of his own, but they are the fault of everyone else, especially of women. We kind of we see this a lot in like rape situations, right? Like a lot of people will blame the alcohol, where probably both people were drinking, in some cases just one, and they will blame the woman for the rape, even though it's not her fault. And so to me, this kind of feels like not as drastic or horrible of a situation, but a similar situation. It has its parallels, at least I think it does, in that this woman is responsible. She's devious. She's playing tricks on him. She's pawning her child off on him. She's a prostitute. So therefore, what she says can't be true, or shouldn't be taken literally. And the child is her fault, not his. I think that it has a lot to say, and I think that there are plenty of interpretations of this ballad. Um, and I would love to hear some of your own. So if you have interpretations, let me know. And then the next specific case that I'm going to look at is cassava beer. So cassava beer is made from cassava, and it's similar to sorghum beer. Sorghum beer is made from sorghum. I know, surprise, shocking. But what I want to talk about is this story of Yurupari. Again, mispronunciation, not my strong suit. I apologize. But Yurupari, he's part of this story, this tale that's told in an area that's like close to the Amazon. So the myth begins with this European mother who is a virgin, and not only is she a virgin, she also does not have any sexual parts at all. She doesn't have a vagina. She doesn't have ovaries, right? She doesn't have any sexual parts at all. Eventually, she is or becomes impregnated by drinking a cassava beer or a kashiri, or just kashiri, by drinking kashiri. In other versions of the myth, just juices from fruit drop onto her. But in most cases of the myth, she becomes impregnated by drinking kashiri. This which is kind of it's a sacred alcohol in this myth, and to people in general. This child grows inside of her for months, for a full 9-month period, but she doesn't have any sexual parts, so she's unable to give birth to this child. And so one day she decides to go out to the river to bathe, to ease her labor pains, and just general pains with having a child in her for 9 months. You know how it is. And then a fish in the river bites her and opens up a wound with which the child is born from. This child is Yurupari. Almost immediately, the boy, Yurupari, is taken away by shamans. He's taken away from his mother, and it's kind of decided that he's not to be raised by women at all. And he's not supposed to be in the presence of women. He's not supposed to be around women, near women. His own mother cannot be near him. For years, he is living with these shamans, being cared for by them, and they teach him all these different things, all these different ways of life. He is taught about nature, divine beings, divinity, the cosmos, social ways of life. And one day, eventually, Yurupari returns to the village from which he was born, by that river that the fish bit his mother. And he decides that he's going to begin teaching new rules to this village. He introduces the idea of marriage to people. He introduces, kind of along with that, the idea that women need to be controlled, that there should be rules about the power that women can have, and so on and so forth. And of course, the men in the village don't mind this at all. They're actually quite happy with it. They almost rejoice at Yurupari's teachings and rules. One of the few roles that women have is making kashiri, making cassava beer, or cassava, the drink. I don't know if it was called beer at the time. I doubt that it was. And he brings all the men to his home. He invites them over, and he intends to share all this kashiri with them, and give them all these other great wisdoms that he has to offer, more rules, more truths about the world. And he asks the women of the village to make and prepare kashiri, the kashiri that he wants to share with the men. And he wants them to make this cassava, to prepare the cassava in the beverage, because there is a cassava like the plant, but cassava the beverage. So whenever I say cassava, I mean the beverage. But the women had learned about what Yurupari was doing. They know that he's trying to reduce their power, to take away their power, to enforce rules that make it so they are to be controlled. And so they refuse to give the men in Yurupari this kashiri, this cassava. And this is like one of the few things that they have left. They refuse. They refuse to do it. He orders these women to prepare the sacred drink kashiri, and the women continue to refuse. So he becomes enraged. He becomes very angry that they deny his requests. At the same time, he takes, in a similar journey that he went with the shaman, he takes several children out to see nature. In other cases, they were just there or out in the woods already. But he takes them out to the women, or out into the nature, and not to the women. And what the children do when they're out in nature, not being supervised by Yurupari, is they eat the fruit from Yurupari's favorite tree, despite him having warned them not to do so. And well, again, this just turns him more angry. And so because they ate the fruit from his favorite tree, he decides to eat them. In some cases, he kind of tricks the children. He says that there's a storm coming, and that in order to hide, they must get inside of his mouth to hide. But he eats them. The men of the village are upset. They're angry. They're very upset with Yurupari for eating their children. And these were the same men that were happy with the new rules that Yurupari was bringing to the village. These rules about how men and women should connect, and the relationship that they should have. And so the men rise up. They rise up in anger and rebellion. That their children have been killed, so of course they do. They take Yurupari, they grab him, and they throw him into a fire, and they burn his body, and all that remains are the ashes of his bones. And a new plant, the palm tree, grows from the ashes of his bones. That is the tale, or this myth, the story of Yurupari. And I think that this is one of the first ones that got me interested in this topic specifically, because to me it's so clearly, it's blatant how gendered this is. It tells the story of men controlling women. And what I like to think of this, or one interpretation that I have of this, is that Yurupari is basically this cassava, this kashiri personified, because he is born from a virgin with no sexual parts, who should not physically be able to have him. She births him because she drinks cassava. I think that kind of represents Yurupari as this cassava itself. And rallied together, these men become more controlling, more angry because of Yurupari, or if I'm to continue my interpretation of cassava, by drinking they become enraged, they become more controlling, they want more power. And yet the women, they're not supposed to drink it. They're supposed to make it. They're supposed to make more of this drink. They're supposed to make more children. That's all they're good for. And again, you see this like permeating theme of men and women. And I do apologize that this episode is very male-female binary. I do not want to talk specifically in the binary, but a lot of these tales, these myths, these stories, they deal with gender in a very binary way, where it's male and female, man and woman. I think that it's just really interesting to see how these stories kind of continue to show a theme of male dominance in some way, and then kind of like either the anger or the rage or the control that men gain from drinking, and then how that fault is almost always laid upon the women. One final thing that I kind of want to talk about briefly. I don't know a whole lot about it, but there's this kind of tale or myth that witches, as we kind of know it, pointy hat, old woman, kind of weird wart nose thing, stirring a cauldron, that the idea of a witch as we know it, like Salem witch, right, comes from alewives. That's largely inaccurate and it's been debunked. And while maybe it was true in some cases, maybe some instances of it are true, I almost find it more interesting that that myth came to be than if it were true. Because I think the idea, and I think that this is a very powerful idea, is like these drinks, the topic of alcohol in general can have such great influence on society because it's played an enormous role in society. In the same sense that pirates are associated with rum, even though that's not really accurate. Pirates at the time would have been drinking pretty much anything. It wouldn't have been just rum. And yet, pirates have this association with rum because of stories that were written about it. And it's kind of similar, where a lot of people believe that alewives gave rise to witches. Alewives essentially were, to explain it if you don't already know, alewives were basically wives that were at home. They took care of the children. They did typical housewife stuff, making food, raising the children. They didn't work. But one of the things that they did as well, or used to do, is they would make alcohol. And then a lot of people believe alewives were then turned into witches. Not turned into witches in that they literally became witches, but there's this idea that the alewife is how people believed witches to come to be as a thing. Witches in general have always been a just misogynistic show of power. Men don't like it when women have power, intelligence, smarts, whatever, and so any women that kind of displayed these traits were then deemed witches. And so people tend to associate the alewife with witches, I think, because alewives eventually did start to be mistreated or told that they shouldn't be doing what they were doing, because it kind of gave them more power. Because alcohol had so much economic trading power. It's absurdly popular everywhere. And so when women were started producing it at home, men kind of took that as like them taking more power. And so eventually the alewife kind of died off because they didn't, generally speaking, they shouldn't have been allowed to have like that power to make alcohol, to sell it, to do whatever with it, because that was problematic. Not to me. I'm not saying I'm upset with that. I'm perfectly... If you want to be an alewife, you can be an alewife. I no, I don't have a problem with it at all. I just... The people at the time had that issue, right? It became problematic. The very fact that we've connected these two to like alewives and witches together is so fascinating, because it just continues to tell the story of how of male dominance, of male control, of male power, and how that has just kind of led to hatred towards women who assume powerful roles in communities. And then to wrap it all up, I want to kind of talk about more generalities, um, about just alcohol in general, because I think that there's a lot that we could talk about, right? I think the idea of drinking, of consuming alcohol or liquor or whatever, has always been more of like a masculine thing. There's a large body of evidence that indicates that social drinking is like a primary cultural symbol of manliness. And I'm taking that as a quote from one of my sources. And you see this like in media and in all sorts of different things. Like like picture any bar, and I bet what most of you will picture is like this typical kind of like man cave aesthetic. um just like bar that's, you know, like very, very masculine looking, right? To see how like the role of men has also kind of been related so deeply with alcohol. If someone told me to imagine someone drinking like whiskey or gin or uh soju or sake or like literally anything, I pretty much always think of just like this kind of older man, probably wearing a suit, sitting in like this big leather chair in front of a fireplace with like a round little whiskey glass or whatever other kind of glass, just sipping on it, like with maybe a newspaper in hand, right? And I think that that's interesting. That to me, I relate alcohol so much to like this masculine kind of role. I think that too kind of comes into why a lot of men feel pressured into drinking. A lot of underage, maybe not even underage, but you know, just young drinking problems, drinking issues, alcoholic tendencies come from men. A majority of it is from men. And people have found that of college students, a large source of problematic drinking in men is come from masculine norms and socially constructed beliefs of what they expect it means to be a man. You get like these large social gatherings, and guys kind of assume, because of toxic masculinity or what have you, that in order to be a man, they have to consume alcohol. And they feel like they have to be able to take a lot of liquor. Like being a lightweight is more gay, it's homosexual, feminine, whatever. And why is that? Again, I think part of it is like we've associated this, like as we've seen through some of these themes, we've associated this idea that women shouldn't be drinking, or they shouldn't be drinking as much because they can't handle it, right? They can't handle that. Or if they do drink a lot, then it becomes a problem. And they have to actually like take responsibility for their actions, whereas men don't have to do so as much. In one study, 68% of male college students equated the ability to physically consume and tolerate large amounts of alcohol with adverse reactions to being characteristics of masculine behavior. Men who are able to quote unquote like drink up or drink less or drink more, sorry, is just seen as more manly. You know, toxic masculinity in a lot of ways has hurt men, like in general. And I think that one of the ways that we kind of see that play out frequently is in alcohol consumption. You picture the typical, like stereotypical, I should say, like frat guy. It's like someone gets really drunk, drinking a lot at a party, maybe hits on a girl or two, and that's what it means to be a man for some reason. And I don't, coming from a used to be cis man, coming from someone who does still identify with the man-ish title, Sorry, that sounds weird. And certain masculine roles. I don't think that I want that, and I don't think most men should want that. But I also wanted to talk about this because I found this really great article about mezcal. So we're going back to mezcal, but no myths, nothing like that. In Mexico, in Mexico, there's a large issue where there's been a large rise in violence against women, in femicide, in Mexico. In 2019 in Mexico, 1,010 women were reported murdered by Mexico by the local authorities, which was more than double reported in 2015. And Mexico has always had, I think, kind of issues, and this isn't just Mexico. I don't want to like throw Mexico under the bus, because that's unfair to do. There are issues everywhere, right? Like America, there are issues too. There's so many issues in America. Don't even fucking get me started. But there's been a lot of violence issues based on women and gender in Mexico. They found that only 3 out of 10 female farmers in Mexico get paid for their work. And so one of the talks that is in this article is about, is there a way, is there a role for mezcal in creating more equality here? Women are pretty much always a part of the process in making mezcal, but a lot of it is just wives helping out, or they're doing like the paperwork. You know, they're not doing the labor side of things. They're not doing I don't know, the other parts of alcohol production, which I probably could point out all the difficulties and labor intensive technicalities and blah blah blah, and it might bore you, it might not, but I don't know. A lot of women are like basically told to oversee like inventory, look at production control, and have more administrative duties. But like historically, women have pretty much always played a role in the production of alcohol. In some cases, they were the only ones producing it. In a lot of Aztec, Mayan, you name it, civilizations, it was women that were making and producing alcohol. They couldn't consume it, they weren't allowed to consume it, but they were making it, right? Women have always been involved in the production of alcohol. So why is it that it's kind of more taboo for a woman to drink? Or why is it that men or drinking is seen as manly, right? And I think a lot of it comes back down to power and control. And because alcohol has played such an enormous part in society and economics, right? Even just within a small community, I think that because of that, if men get to control that, then that just proves that they have more power, that they have more control. I think maybe because in certain histories, a lot of alcoholic beverages were appointed to like only higher class people could drink them. Only like leaders and upper class people could consume it. And traditionally speaking, in a lot of history, men have always been in those positions of higher class in power. And so by, I guess maybe by correlating those two, when there have been large periods of time where alcoholic consumption has been delegated to only the top of the top, and those people were usually men, then that kind of helped to associate alcoholic consumption with like a manly thing to do. I hope this episode was somewhat coherent, and I hope that it was enjoyable, and I hope that you're all having a fantastic day. Remember, drink responsibly if you're going to drink. Please, do it for me. Do it for good old Ryan. Please, pretty please. And all you men out there listening, that goes doubly so for you, because listen, you don't get, listen, okay? Don't fucking, just stop listening to all those weird gender norms and whatnot, masculinity. Stop it. Stop it, okay? You need to stop thinking like that. Anyway, I've gotten off track. But I hope that this episode was entertaining. It's definitely a departure from my usual talk, but I do hope that you enjoyed it. I hope you liked learning about these different tales and stories. And again, all the links to the sources that I've used for this episode will be in the YouTube description. So if you're listening elsewhere and you want to look at these sources more, head on over to YouTube, Kinda Queer, and they'll be there under this episode's description. So thanks again, everyone, so much for listening. I hope you're having a wonderful day, and remember to stay queer, and I'll see you in the next episode. And also, my phone, I'm so unprofessional.